welcome to everyone here. Welcome to everybody online. Joshua Whitaker is this year's BSA Arts Bursary Award holder, and he is affectionately known in our family as the artist in the attic. The first award was made in 2003, and it's evolved to be a collaboration with the University of the Arts, London. So that is Camberwell, Chelsea, St. Martin's and Wimbledon Graduate School. Over the years, we've been thrilled and inspired by the artist in the attic, and Josh is no exception to this. He has engaged us in probing and thought-provoking conversation, and of course, fun banter over drinks. And he's actually really shown us new ways of thinking about the BSA, thinking about the work that we do in the BSA, but also importantly, I think for us, thinking about the way we use our spaces in the BSA too. And he promises to transform some of those spaces in a few weeks' time by having dancers in the library and in the Fitch? No. Just the library. Oh, just in the library. Okay, I'm glad. First of all, I'm glad that's not happening. Second of all, I'm glad that Bangalore didn't have a heart attack when I announced that. But on to Josh himself. Josh he's exhibited nationally and internationally. He's well known for his work in filmmaking. He did his undergraduate degree in fine arts in the University of Arts, London. He then went on and did a master's in philosophy and art theory. Is that right? And he is doing his PhD. Done his PhD, nearly finished his PhD at St. Martin's on watch me garble this, Messianic Translatability, the script for San Paolo by Pier Paolo Pasqualini. Woohoo! And he's also, at the same time as doing his PhD and being artist in the attic, he's also a lecturer at St. Martin's as well. And in fact, when he first came to the BSA, he was marking loads of undergraduate scripts and things like that, and I felt very sorry for him. His last two movies, one was called On Sacred Time, another Pier Paolo, A Portrait, and his most recent publication has been in the journal So Anyway on Pier Paolo as well. One of his big parts that we would like to emphasize is that he was part of the inaugural year of the School of the Damned, an alternative arts school, which is now in its 11th year. Personally, I've really enjoyed having Josh as the artist in the attic, and you've set a very high bar for future artists in the attic. And if they don't work out, we'll have you back anytime. Over to you, Josh. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, Rebecca, for that. Well, surprisingly lovely. I thought I was going to get I thought I was going to get a bit more. I thought I was going to get a bit more roasted than that. To be honest, I thought it was going to be a kind of. Okay. Let's see if these slides are working. So, as Rebecca's already mentioned, I'm here as the arts researcher in residence. And so what I'm going to do over the next 40 minutes is to talk through some of the research that I've been doing and working on whilst I've been here, and show some video and some music and some work by other artists and directors and theorists that inform my work. So the thing that I've spent my time doing here is trying to make a film. And I'm using this word try in quite a deliberate way, from the French essai, where we get the word essay, a text which performs an idea, sees where it can go. The essay is a text that, unlike a thesis, sees what's possible rather than nailing down a position. So what I've been doing here is to kind of try to gather a set of ideas together to see what they can do. And in a sense, this presentation is a performance of those ideas, of an essay spoken out and set to images and sound. The way I think of doing research is of gathering material of putting together a constellation of references, of ideas, and seeing what they can do, how they can perform. It's a little bit like a wind-up toy in that you invest it in energy. You kind of give it its potentiality, you power it up, and you let it go, and you can see where it goes. You can see what kind of direction it takes. So I'm interested, the other thing that I'm interested in is scripts and screenplays, which, like the essay, they are forms of text which are mediatory. They don't assert a definitive position. They set things in motion, they're suggestive, they're interpretive, they allude to a certain kind of movement of bodies, of sound, of emotion setting. And like the essay, they invite an idea of trying something out, like a skit or a sketch or a turn. So this is how I've thought about the work that I've been doing here and the writing that I've been doing here, which is to try gather this idea of acid history together. And I suppose the two outcomes of this are going to be this presentation and talk, which will exist maybe in some way as a text or a performance outside of this setting, but also the film that I'll finally make, which I'm filming, as Rebecca said, in a couple of weeks' time in the library with a choreographer and 2 dancers. Which initially, I kind of thought this was a bit of a shame that the film wouldn't be finished at this moment. But, you know, filmmaking is quite a long process, and it's kind of slightly unsurprising to me, as well as annoying that it's not done. But I think this lecture will perform a kind of a script for that idea. So how do I get to the idea of acid history? So this is an idea that's kind of been percolating for a little bit of time with me, and it begins with the idea of acid communism, which is an idea developed by Mark Fisher and Jeremy Gilbert, who's Professor of Cultural and Political Theory at University of East London. And while they jointly worked, this is a concept, and the first major publication of which was going to be a book authored by Mark entitled Acid Communism. Unfortunately, Mark Fisher took his own life in 2017. So the only published part of that book is as the introduction, which was posthumously included in K-Punk, his collected writings. Jeremy Gilbert has since published and spoken widely and developed the idea of acid as a political concept, which seeks to find the potentiality and collectivity as a response to neoliberalism's emphasis and centralizing the idea of the individual as key to its political hegemony. What Gilbert and Fisher see as the potential in something like the idea of acid socialism or psychedelic communism is the power of the counterculture developed in the 50s and 60s to collectively imagine a future society. They see this as the final point in near history where the West has some form of mass rethinking of how capitalism can be. For Gilbert and Fisher, this is a brief moment where there's a collective belief in reinventing the future outside of the potential offered by the dominant political structures. The civil rights movement, feminism, gay rights, environmentalism would be the broad political outcomes and the kind of cultural and political shift that occurs, with more holistic ideas around meditation, yoga, of mental health finding ferment in the West at this point. And these are ideas that are explicitly anti-conservative, anti-violent, and privilege radical reform rather than some kind of revolution. As I kind of said in the intro to this talk, acid is an adjective in Gilbert and Fisher's concept. It's a particular way of seeing the world, which, like the psychedelic experience, engages a notion of finding the underexplored connections between things, seeing the world as vibrant and filled with potentiality, that doesn't reduce every social engagement to value exchange. Neither Gilbert, Fisher, or I are advocating the use of drugs. or taking acid. It is simply a provocation that, to quote Gilbert, says that acid could be taken to refer to a set of practices and ideas which are one and the same time mystical and materialist. A materialist mysticism which acknowledges the complex potentials of human embodied existence without tying the recognition to any set of supernatural or theistic beliefs. The materialist mysticism would treat the investigation of technologies of non-self as one of its key priorities. So it's in this collective wellspring of the counterculture as the last kind of widespread instance that this kind of thinking can be seen. And what Fisher and Gilbert see as collapsing this somewhat utopian but progressive movement is what we now call neoliberalism, which we can define in a couple of ways. The first is the ideology that is no other way than the free market capitalism. There's no escaping it. There's nothing beyond it. And even if you want that, it's futile. It's without merit in pursuing. The most distilled version of this is a phrase coined by Frederick Jameson or Slavoj Žižek, depending on who you ask, which says, at the present moment in time, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. The ideology of neoliberalism is so powerful that it becomes easier to imagine climate collapse, nuclear war, rampant pandemics, wiping out all of civilization as we know it, before there would be some kind of fundamental change in the way that capital operates. The second definition of neoliberalism would be the individual in competition with other individuals is the only self-reckoning, self-aware, organizing principle by which a state can be organized. And this is to quote Gilbert, it's the idea that of the private before the public, of the personal before the social. What neoliberalism does in the middle of the 20th century is take the logic of the free market and apply it to the actual functions of how a state operates. This is self-evident in the way that we treat the problem of harming people, of home ownership, of judging educational ability, of how laws are exercised. Personal responsibility is the sole arbiter for judgment. The socialization, biases, prejudice, and imposed economic situation on a person are not recognized in this system of neoliberalism. The more insidious element of this logic is how it makes each individual in society a kind of entrepreneur. It reduces us all not only to consumers, but even more radically, it says that the only way to achieve what most of us would consider basic levels of stability in housing and in health, in comfort in old age, in safety, and more generally of a just society, is to level up, to develop yourself as a product which trades various forms of economic, social, and cultural capital in order to make your way through the world. The language of this move from person to entrepreneur is clear in social media, where it's described as being a boss, of hustling, of grinding, and the only genuine access to emotion or a sense of self is through the scope of you as a singularity in competition with other people. This is something that Fisher developed into the idea of capitalist realism, a short book working on the idea that this is the most maddening form of ideology, that we're in a constant state of stress test, that the contemporary melancholy, depression, and mental health problem come from this intense pressure cooker of competition, on top of which you're perpetually told there's no other way. This is the only way in which society can function. This is a position Gilbert says he finds impossible to see any serious philosophic or religious practice advocating. Acid socialism defines this as the primary problem of contemporary life. The route Gilbert and Fisher advocate out of this are varied, including the raising of class consciousness, collective joy, celebration of weirdness, and play, some of which I'm going to refer back to. So how does this work into an idea of acid history? So I tie this definition of acid as an adjective, as a way of looking at the world, to Walter Benjamin's concept of history, which is a concept that works on the basis of linking the material with the mystical, finding a non-chronology or weird connection and vibrancy in the way in which concepts attach to each other, and which allows for the past to be drawn into the future. This is quite a philosophically complex idea that I could kind of spend the next 40 minutes doing, which I'm not going to bore you with. I think the simplest way of understanding this as a methodology is to think of events and things and people in relationship with each other, which previously wouldn't have been or could be read in some kind of linear historical time. That is a kind of set of interlinked points, not on a line, not in succession, but of a cloud, of a rhizome, of a constellation of events in conversation. The purpose of this new way of observing the world is what Benjamin called profane illumination, the observance of the vibrant immanence of history, culture, and potential in the material world. Avery Gordon describes Benjamin's writing on surrealism and revolution and the potential for profane illumination as such. Benjamin described the materialist anthropological inspiration of the surrealist experience in Paris of urban everyday life in their efforts to win the energies of intoxication for revolution. The surrealists hoped to bring to the point of explosion the immense force of atmosphere concealed in everyday things. The vibrant concealment and atmosphere held within things is precisely the capacity of a concept like acid history and acid socialism. It's a form of thinking that reimagines the past life of objects, and brings them and kind of performs them as a new version of the future, which is being denied. It's a form of thinking which actively engages weirdness, which, like acid, should be taken on face value as a term, but is also worth picking over to reveal some other even stranger and weirder capacities. So etymologically, the weird has its root in the Old English word meaning fate, chance, destiny, or fortune. The Norse and German roots meaning to bend, to turn, to weave and become. It's only in Macbeth that weirdness becomes associated with the type of strangeness we give it as a word. The weird sisters, the three witches, the Moirai, the dealers of fate, shift its meaning. I nearly called this talk How to Be Weird, how to engage with older forms of being weird, of predicting the future. Being weird as a mode of reading the world. In this sense, the Delphic oracle was weird. In his notes for Ulysses, Joyce says, places remember events. When I first got to Athens, unfortunately, I came down with COVID, which was shit. And somewhat kind of masochistically, I decided to read Ulysses. Kind of took it as the opportunity to get through this book. And it's a book that obviously unfolds over the course of a day. It kind of has a unit of time as its signature. But the other prominent idea in play is that of place, of Dublin as a fast repository of history and experience embodied in place. The Delphic navel is used as a refrain throughout the book for this concept, as a sense of the ancient world, integral to an ideation of gods and humans communing, of connecting, of the future being predicted, and of the political engaging with the mythic, of weirdness in action. The idea of acid history is to witness this kind of myth and treat it seriously, to recognize that we're all still haunted by these things, and they come back at inopportune times. A kind of haunting, and haunting is never a choice. It's something that I think anybody who's interested in ruins and remains and traces and absence can understand, that are energies which choose not to be forgotten. Ghosts are a part of the DNA of objects and of place. Ghosts and hauntings record themselves in stone and architecture and land that refuse to be forgotten. Some of the images I've shown today are the rock and mineral samples that come from the Finch laboratory, which when looked at under a microscope, look like brown-grey smudges on a slither of glass. But under the correct conditions, these kind of psychedelic images can be seen. And these are images that are encoded in the world, but just require the correct observation. The video that you can see at the moment is of slides and negatives held within the archive here of Delphi. And there's a long tradition of the idea of ghosts recording themselves on these material aspects of cellulose, of magnetic strips, and within the photographic technique. So the idea of acid history is to commune with this idea. In the introduction to Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, Janice Radway describes the book in the following terms: as a mediation on the extended intellectual consequences of historically constituted divides between the social and the individual, the abstract and the concrete, the analytical and the imaginary. The Lebanese poet Atal Adnan wrote, "The olive tree in Delphi, next to the temple of Sikyon, remembers the oracle, saying that somewhere in the plain linking the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, music will displace the sky." And it's the opening line of this which is most interesting to me. The tree remembers. The myth is inscribed in the landscape as a prediction of a hopeful future. The tree gets weird for us in this poem. It also brings to mind my favourite line from Alice in Wonderland, where the Queen of Hearts says, "It's a poor form of memory that works only backwards," which is a weird idea. So by drawing on Fisher and Gilbert's ideation of acid, of Benjamin's profane illumination in objects, we can see historical memory somehow held in place in somewhere like Delphi. And this is how I think of acid history, as a way to do what Lewis instructs and to remember the future could be other, that even though you're perpetually told it can only be one way. Mark Fisher put this most clearly when he said the role of this type of thinking is to reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable, to be mere contingency, just as it is to make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable. So suppose what's this got to do with what I do? So when I first came here, I wanted to make a film about St. Paul and Delphi. I thought there was a parallel between Paul's peripatetic life and the epistles, which are focused on specific places and people, and Delphi as a site imbued with a weird acid energy. But I couldn't find Paul in Athens or Ephesus or Corinth. And in the same way that I couldn't find him when I visited Rome last year. I spent a lot of my PhD researching and writing about the life of St. Paul through the life and lens of another filmmaker, Pier Paolo Pasolini. Pasolini lived between 1922 and 1975 and continues to be a controversial figure. At the point of his murder in 1975, Pasolini left a manuscript entitled Plan for a Film about St. Paul, which was finally published in São Paulo. And this has been the kind of primary object or influence on my thinking and my PhD work. So in St. Paul, Pasolini renders his life almost completely through the dialogue of the Bible. It takes all of its language, all of its dialogue, all of its text directly from the Gospels, not from the Gospels, from Acts and from the epistles. And Pasolini takes the narrative ordering of Paul's life from the New Testament. In his São Paulo, the Pharisee are collaborative stooges with the Nazi regime in Paris in the 20th century. They're the fascistic Vichy government, and Saul is the chief hunter of members of the resistance, which are embodied in the followers of Christ. Saul's conversion from fascistic, vengeful Saul into the saintly Paul also occurs on a journey in Pasolini's version. This is from Paris to Barcelona, which stand by analogy for Jerusalem and Damascus. He's struck down by Christ's energy, and a kind of transition occurs. But unlike the Bible, this isn't a negation, but an addition of conflicting and intertwined positions between the pious, saintly weak Paul and the fascistic, dogmatic organizer of Saul. Place is used in Pasolini's script in much the same way that Benjamin describes the immense force of atmosphere contained within objects. The location of Pasolini's version of St. Paul are acid-type environments. They hold ghosts and they perform ideas. In shifting from the 1st century to the 20th century, Pasolini transposes place, and these are his words: the center of the modern world, the capital of colonialism and of modern imperialism, the seat of modern power over the rest of the earth, instead of Rome, will be New York. For the cultural and ideological, civil, and in its own way, religious center, the sanctuary of enlightenment and intelligent conformism is no longer Jerusalem, but Paris. And finally, the city that is the equivalent of Athens in that moment is in large measure the Rome of today, seen naturally as a city of grand historical, but not religious tradition. Pasolini recast place, transposed place in order to make it fit the script and line up the ghosts to make this idea of haunting perform itself. In her introduction to the script, Elizabeth Castelli describes the propensity for an alternate view of time in Pasolini that could stand as a description of acid history, as the conviction that temporal difference is illusory. There is no distance between then and now, the separation between the historical and the religious, the real and the ideal. So I've gone on a bit of a deviation into St. Paul and Pasolini here to describe the problem that I had in finding Paul in Athens, in finding the weird energy attached to Paul hiding somewhere. Because in a similar thing happened to Pasolini whilst he was attempting to make the Gospel according to St. Matthew, a film where Pasolini intended to shoot in the original sites of the Bible. And this trip is recorded in a film entitled Location Hunting in Palestine for the Gospel according to Matthew, which I'm going to show a short clip of.
Uno delle ultime però, perché poi il mondo si farà sempre più moderno e così poco usabile per il mio film, così come lo invento adesso. Però questa visione spaventosamente arida, abbandonata delle rive del lago di Tiberiade, ti danno benissimo l'idea del luogo dove Cristo andava a meditare e a piangere. Sono un po' scoraggiato, Andrea, perché se si trattasse di scrivere diversi, probabilmente ne scriverò, Cafarno è un posto sublime, nella sua piccolezza, nella sua estrema angustia, nella sua assoluta mancanza di ogni scenografia. Ma per fare un film la cosa mi impressiona un po', non c'è scena intorno a quello che girerò. Come mai? Lei pensa che tutta la storia evangelica è fatta di queste cose estremamente piccole, misere, senza scenografia, disadorne, affose, divorate dal sole? C'è evidentemente anche questo, senz'altro. Direi che lo scopo particolare dovrebbe essere questo, riassumere, assorbire lo spirito di questa situazione. Poi magari riviverlo, poi magari ricostruirlo, inventarlo forse anche in qualche altro ambiente, in qualche altro posto. Però siccome qui sono avvenuti questi scene, su questi luoghi, su questa terra, qui è stato calpestato, questo è il mare, qui c'è la sinagoga, qui ci sono tutti quanti i monti dove Gesù ha camminato e dove Gesù ha parlato. C'è una specie di geografia della Palestina, una geografia della Terra Santa. E credo che bisogna camminarci pensando, riflettendo, meditarne per assorbirne lo spirito. Allora poi si potrà anche reinventarlo in qualche altro posto, riimmaginarlo, adattarlo anche alla propria sensibilità, alla propria immaginazione. E allora verrà una cosa nuova, perché realmente credo che non si possa parlare di una fotografia dei posti. Credo sia una cosa completamente fuori posto. Ma per quello che mi riguarda penso di aver completamente trasformato la mia immaginazione sui luoghi sacri. Quindi più che adattare i posti alla mia immaginazione, dovrò adattare la mia immaginazione. Altra bella sorpresa.
So this is precisely the issue I encountered in the places that I visited looking for Paul, because I couldn't find what I kind of wanted to see. I couldn't believe what I wanted to believe. But there's another kind of weirdness that I found that was coming from the school itself, of the library and the buildings that I was living in, of the attic that I was living in. So I started to look more at the school and the archives to think about a new way of kind of making a film. And I started to think about the final scene of Salo by Pier Paolo Pasolini, of 120 Days of Sodom, which is the scene that you can see on the left. And Salo is a notoriously violent film, and it's not something I readily recommend watching. And if you do, I'd take this as a trigger warning for it. But I think in the final scene, there's a kind of version of hope and of utopianism that can be found. So Salo ends with two of the soldiers dancing this slow waltz together in a room filled with cubist and Fauvist art. One of the soldiers adjusts the radio, revealing the soundtrack of the penultimate scene. One of the soldiers adjusts the radio, revealing the soundtrack of the final torture scene to be Karl Orff's Carmina Bruna. He changes it and settles on a piece of music called Santanto Triste, which is a kind of wistful and light and optimistic tune, and marks a major gear change from the kind of moody and monstrous orchestra that soundtracked the previous executions of prisoners that you've just seen. The two young men embrace with each other. They dance slowly around the room, with one asking the other if he has a girlfriend at home and what her name is. And the implication of this, which is often missed by the exposure of such violent images seconds before, is that life continues outside of the scenes that we've been watching. Another ending for Pasolini's film shows an ensemble dance scene in the main hall of the mansion, which includes all of the cast and crew, including Pasolini. This is a now lost piece of cinema, although there is images of it, and they show it to be a celebratory dance in which those who've died come back to life, a form of community through dance is produced, and a new joyful time comes into existence. Both scenes suggest an optimism grown out of communality, a sudden and totally unexpected shift into a world that seemed impossible seconds before. The filming I've planned in a few weeks' time will work with two male Greek dancers dancing through the BSA library in a similar form to that you see here. And it'll also use some of the other images that I've shown you today of Delphi and of rock samples to try to produce an idea of acid histories and engagement with the past that is here and now and allows for a glimpse of the possibility of a future that is not already defined, that is not resolutely individual, and that embraces collectivity and weirdness. The dance that they will perform will be set to a spiritual called Cinnamon, which the most popular recording of is Nina Simone's, which you can hear now. And it's a song which takes the idea of acid ideation of takes the idea of acid and the ideation of weirdness very seriously. It's a song where the final judgment and appeal to God to be saved, when God denies salvation. The singer asks in turn for help from rocks, from the river, from the sea, all of which answer but can't help. It's a song both about the latent atmospheric forces held within land that precede Christian thought, as well as the power of the state to help you, but deny you that help on the basis that you must help yourself, that you must be an entrepreneur, you must be savior to yourself. Like much gospel, spiritual and blues music, political oppression is camouflaged and baked into religious themes, the mystical and the materialist in unison. The use of this song is itself a callback to the film Inland Empire by David Lynch, which is the scene that's playing behind me on the right, which is also an intensely weird film that looks and shows some of the darker elements of Hollywood. The main actress, played by Laura Dern, is an avatar for the viewer walking between stage sets, points of constellation in the history of cinema. The final scene, like Pasolini's Salo, is a point of reconciliation in the form of dance. So this clip might seem somewhat contrary to the abstract and some of the things that I've already said, that I wouldn't be talking about acid or LSD or the psychedelic experience or expanded drug culture. as an element of acid history. And although it does show an element of that culture, and is also quite funny, there's something more kind of interest. I think there's something more interesting happening with this, which is to do with collectivity and tradition, of meaning embodied in that place, and of an chronology of time that can be seen when viewing this clip with a kind of acid historical glasses on. So there's an idea of dancing in ruins here, dancing into the past, which is an idea borrowed from the artist Jeremy Gilbert and a piece of work entitled Everybody in the Place, an incomplete history of Britain from 1984 to 1992, which is a piece of work which has some way been a kind of guiding star for some of the things that I'm interested in. In that work, Della says, Manchester during the Industrial Revolution and then post-industrial Britain, you have all these spaces that are empty and ready for something else. In Blackburn, they're free parties, and they use the factories and places where people had worked until very recently. In the Industrial Revolution, you'd have been in a building with noisy machinery, which was hot and dangerous. And within a generation, people are going into these buildings to socialize and to be deafened by choice. You're basically sort of dancing in these places where your ancestors worked. These parties are nothing less than a death ritual that mark the transition of Britain from an industrial to a service economy. For me, rave offers up profound imagery like this, which messes with our national identity. Britain old and Britain new at the same time, dancing in front of a 500-year-old stately home. The British countryside is an uncontrollable place, which has never really been tamed. So this is dance as work of the old world giving birth to a new one, of counterculture, built on the promise of freedom, operating outside of established order or in opposition to it, in which collective joy becomes the basis on which to think of the world you really want. The music of this period is like an acid flash, bringing the ancient countryside, its governance, the Industrial Revolution, and the activity of labour into view. The lyrics of the music instruct you to work your body, to move your body, to jack your body, to grind and to hustle. The activity of work shifts from that of leisure to that of enjoyment. The ghostly rhythms, the machines that once were housed in these buildings, soundtrack, acid history. The beat is made from machines which sound like the machines that once worked over the land, that cut tunnels, that wove wool and cotton. So the final thing I'd like to do is to read an extract from Humphrey Jennings' Pandemonium, which is a book unlike anything else I'm aware of, in that it's both a compilation of texts about the Industrial Revolution, the subtitle being The Coming of the Machine as Seen by Contemporary Observers, 1660 to 1886. But at the same time, Jennings puts together this kind of montage script. And in the introduction to the book, he refers to it as a film. One of the excerpts from this kind of bricolage text is as follows. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that could have been made red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and it had a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye. The vast piles of building, full of windows. There was a constant rattling and trembling all day long. where the pistons of the steam engine work monotonously up and down, like the head of an elephant in the state of melancholy madness. So that's an extract from Charles Dickens' Hard Times, where he's describing Corktown. But it also feels like Dickens describing a memory of the future, of knowing somehow the psychedelic acid experience is already built into that kind of architecture. So I started by describing this lecture as a kind of essay or a script for a film that's still in the process of being made, in which I'll film in a couple of weeks' time in the library here. And I hope it will be a kind of a weird film. I hope it'll be an acid film. And I hope it will have the school as a kind of character in it. To think about place as a way in which to imagine a new kind of future. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. So, can you take this opportunity to refill the glasses while?
Yeah, so I didn't do the intermission.
No,
Sorry.
Not to be theatrical. So, would you like to just refill your glasses and think about the questions for Josh? Well, let's do that and then I'll look. Josh, what would you like?
I'd love another glass of white wine, please. Thank you. Oh yeah, sorry. We're all refilling our glasses, so hold on for the questions. Yes. And then I went to go see it on 35 minutes, which is it's a very strange experience watching it with a group of people rather than, I'd only ever seen it by the time. So is it legal in Greece? I don't know. I think it's still sensitive, right?
Okay, folks. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Josh, for that amazing huge range of ideas that you've given us. Huge range of ideas that are certainly underexplored, and I'd say particularly in our environment here, but in other places too, like counterculture, surrealism, and with the background of the sections from the fish, and then you talked about memory, ghosts, place and objects in our past lives, and all of these things, again with the background of BSA, Gen Z, and the upper house, but we've got the library as well. I mean, it was in the elevator from the art of the class. Yeah, it was very nice to see that. But in all of that, how well, I mean, life does continue, isn't that's the big story, I think. Well, it's not a big story, that's I have no idea what the story is, to be honest. I have a question. Oh, should I open up the door to anyone who wants to see if they've got a question first? Or can I go first? Oh, good. This is very keen. Go for it.
Oh, Josh, thank you so much for that. That was so fascinating. And then it's interesting kind of like mind-altering drugs are used in these expressions of cultural movements. Like I couldn't help but think of the opposite of like champagne socialism and acid kind of communism. I was wondering if I could ask you about temporality in your idea of acid history, because I can't help but think that our idea, the very organization expression that we have on time is rooted to a very structured Roman Catholic Julian idea of time. So within this idea of acid history, is there a kind of reconceptualization of order in the past, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I think that if that would be something that Benjamin does in his concept of history, but equally, I think for Gilbert and Fisher, or for kind of there's an idea of linear time as being essentially kind of product of the Enlightenment, or that it's a relatively contemporary idea that things just precede each other. And exactly like you're saying, there's no, the concept of teleology, of that there is some kind of end, it kind of produces a kind of slightly troublesome idea, in that it works on the basis of everything building towards some kind of culmination. So within kind of that, which all of these are kind of like, this is a Hegelian concept of history, which is an endless building until some kind of redemptive moment, to some resurrection, which is a big kind of concept within the Judaic Christian idea. Yeah, because within lots of other religions, within Hinduism, within particularly or Buddhism as well, you have an idea of a cyclical form of time, that things return, that they come back again. The idea of this version of time which just builds on each other, I think shouldn't be taken as some kind of neutral ideation. And I think even the idea of, to go back to the Industrial Revolution, or some of the ideas at the back end of that, the idea of time as some kind of unit which you measure, again, is quite a contemporary idea. You know, that you have an 8-hour working day, how much time you have for leisure, when you might do something within a day, as measured by a clock, rather than other forms of experience, of kind of embodied experience. So I think, yeah, there's lots of versions of alternate ways of reading time that I think play into that idea of kind of acid history.
Am I allowed to open? One of the things that struck me was the slight contrast in some of the things that you said. So you talked about past life of objects, which we're all very fond of as archaeologists, which of course, past life of an object is open to multiple interpretations, and therefore oodles of then different interpretations of the past and of that object. But then you contrast that, no, you didn't contrast, but then you mentioned that Galileo's work in the ditch, for example, when you used the section, you mentioned that there was a correct interpretation to the thin section that you showed. And I thought that was quite a stark contrast between the two things of past lives, multiple life of objects, and then one interpretation of a
I think if I said that, it was a kind of slip in the delivery of the lecture, in that I think there's the idea that the kind of the glass sample with this kind of grubby smear on it, they can suddenly kind of perform this other kind of aesthetic experience. Isn't that there's to me, the more interesting version of looking at that, in the images that I was kind of showing, isn't a correct version of that. It is just an alternate way of doing it. Okay. And that I suppose I was trying to use that as a kind of analogy for this slight shift of perception, of moving, of kind of providing some kind of parallax view on an object, which suddenly enlivens it and allows it to perform itself in a different way. And that equally there could be another shift, and it could perform itself again in another fashion.
Are there questions or comments? Does anyone want to do a dance? Are there any questions online?
Yeah.
Okay.
With great pleasure that I ask this question. Can you say more about what is weird about the BSA?
Well, weird in that. So to think of, to kind of give the definition of weird, of kind of an object predicting itself or having some kind of performing an idea, kind of suggesting to you what it is, and of kind of producing some kind of future. So this is an idea that comes from object-oriented ontology, which says, well, you can grant architecture or the coral reef or you allow kind of things to speak to you in a certain way. And one of the things that I thought was quite interesting when I first came here is that there's the American school. I've already said this in a previous seminar, but I think it illustrates this quite well. There's the American school and there's the British school right next to each other. And the British school, slightly smaller, feels a little bit older, it's a bit shabby, it has a kind of patina on it, to be euphemistic. And the American school is much bigger, it's much shinier, there's clearly a kind of evidence of money in a different way. And they kind of perform themselves, they perform a sense of kind of national identity. I suppose one way would be to say that's a kind of projection. But if you kind of grant the architecture a little bit more agency, it's them performing themselves. And that would be a weird way of reading, or an acid way of reading the environment. Yeah.
Other questions? Earlier.
Actually, have you then thought about, or in the context of in Greece, of those two entities, and then like the physical context of this neighborhood and how they perform?
Well, yeah, I think that's when I came here, as I said, I unfortunately came down with COVID. So I spent a lot of time with my mask on, just walking around Athens. And that's there's an idea within Benjamin of the flaneur, of somebody who kind of reads the city.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, kind of coming here and not being able to interact with people and having quite a solitary experience for the first couple of weeks was kind of good, because I'd never been to Athens before, I'd never spent much time here. And I couldn't go into a bar or go into a restaurant, but I could kind of divine, I could kind of work the city, I could flaneur it, I could kind of try to feel a particular way of things being. And yeah, Kolonaki has a kind of odd energy to itself, it feels a bit like kind of the Upper East Side crossed with Mayfair, which is quite a weird, even that's a strange collision of things to me. That's quite, I suppose that's somewhat of a subjective kind of read on it from me. But yeah, I think you can read the city in that way, in that kind of acid way.
Other questions from the floor or online? Is there any other?
Can we get a bit of a teaser about what you will do with the dancers in the library? What type of music will you keep the desks there? Will the books take part?
Yeah, I want to record the books. I'm working with the choreographer at the moment, so it will be between the two types of dance that I showed, the Inland Empire final scene and the Pasolini's final scene. But it will remain as it is. It'll be a kind of movement through. I don't know, it's a strange, it's a hard thing to answer things like that, because when you start making a film, you kind of think you know where it's going to go. And then the process of doing it kind of tells you, or you find it. I think people think of making films as like it's a kind of construction that's incredibly deliberate. And maybe it is when you're making I don't know, Marvel film or something. But I think when you're kind of being a little bit more explorative and kind of feeling your way through it, it sometimes feels more like sculpture or kind of finding a form within something. You know, you kind of have to do it to work out what's actually there. And that, like, pointing at the camera at something makes it do something, or kind of tells you how you should do it. So it's a bit hard to say what it will be. Kind of have the parameters, and then, like the clockwork toy analogy, it's kind of like you set these things in place, and then you kind of, at a certain point, you see what's going to happen.
But it's going to be Nina Simone.
It'll definitely be the Nina Simone, yeah.
Ellie?
Just following on from that, I wonder, because both of the subjects that you showed in those are both final scenes. If I can construct the idea of a Lydia in film, which I suspect is quite contrary to the concept of the acid element. So choosing to follow a general theme of what is first visualized as the final section of the film, do you think it is in any way restrictive for yourself, or in terms of being bound on it as what we see as an end element to a greater picture? Is that intentional, or do you kind of turn it on its head a little bit?
That's good question. Very good question. I think the thing that I find interesting about the idea of the kind of finale is I'm interested in ideas around apocalypse or eschatology, of a kind of lastness of time. I think one of the things I find particularly interesting about apocalypse, that it's like an unveiling, it's a revealing of something in the kind of original sense of the word. So it's not really an ending, it's a realization of something that was there all the time. And obviously I'm kind of interested in St. Paul, I'm interested in kind of Christian ideas of time, but I'm also interested in kind of that idea of it not being a full stop. You know, there is it's a moment of reevaluation, of seeing that the things that were deemed to be necessary were actually contingent, and there was something else that was possible. So yeah, it's a bit of a funny kind of balancing act, I suppose, or it's a slightly paradoxical idea, and I think that's kind of part of why I find it interesting. Yeah.
I don't want to see the product. It's not really exciting.
Thank you.
That's been made. Normally I say we should let the speaker have a glass of wine, but
I've already given one.
Another. And very, very much a wonderful event tonight.
Thank you.
So much, Josh, and thank you for being our artists in the attic.
Thank you.